Story number 1.
The village of Zolotaya Dolina, nestled deep in the Carpathian Mountains of Ukraine, was not the kind of place one visited for pleasure or curiosity. Even locals avoided it after dusk, whispering tales of shadows moving through the dense forests and strange lights flickering in the hills. The place was old, centuries old, and something ancient seemed to cling to its moss-covered stones and cracked wooden homes. I first heard about Zolotaya Dolina from my grandfather, who was born in the village before fleeing west during the Soviet upheavals. He never spoke much about his childhood, only that the forest surrounding the village was alive with things no man should disturb. When he passed, my curiosity grew. I wanted to see for myself what had so haunted him. I arrived at the village in late autumn, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones already setting in. The villagers I met were wary, eyes flickering with suspicion, reluctant to talk about their home's darker history. The few who did warned me simply to be respectful and cautious, especially at night. The house I rented was an old wooden structure at the village edge, bordering the ancient forest. It belonged to a distant relative who no longer lived there. The walls were thick with age, the beams warped and stained with smoke and time. The air inside smelled of earth and damp wood, and I could hear the steady creak and sigh of the house settling. On my first evening, as I lit the stove and prepared a simple meal, I noticed how the forest outside seemed unnaturally still, almost watching. The birds and insects had gone silent. The wind didn't stir the branches. It was a silence that pressed against your ears, the kind that fills you with a cold sense of waiting. That night, I struggled to sleep. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed too deep, too alive. When I closed my eyes, I saw flickers of movement, shapes darting just beyond the reach of my vision. Around midnight, a tapping began on the window facing the forest. Tap, 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 slow and steady. I rose and looked out, but all I could see was the darkness, thick with fog and ancient trees. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it started. Over the next days, the tapping came again, always at midnight, sometimes on the window, sometimes at the door. I found muddy footprints on the porch, small and pale, but there were no tracks leading into the woods or village. It was as if whoever or whatever was coming arrived only to leave again in shadows. Curious, I asked the villagers more about the place. An elderly woman named Baba Ivana, with eyes like polished stones, told me the story of Urina. Urina was a girl from the village over a century ago, said Baba Ivana. She was beautiful, with hair like spun gold and eyes like the mountain lakes. She fell in love with a young woodsman, but when the villagers discovered she was pregnant out of wedlock, they shunned her. Shame and fear drove her into the forest, where she disappeared. Some say she was taken by the Leshy, the forest spirit, or cursed by a witch. Others believe she died alone, her cries swallowed by the trees. The villagers said Urina's spirit wandered the forest edge, searching for her lost child and the love she never knew. At night, she would tap on windows, weeping for help, but anyone who followed the sound was doomed to vanish or go mad. I laughed nervously, brushing it off as folklore. But that night the air grew thick and heavy. The tapping came again, louder this time, echoing through the empty house. I could hear whispers in the wind, words I barely understood, slurred and broken. I stepped outside to the porch, heart pounding. There, in the pale moonlight, I saw her. A woman in white, her long hair covering a face pale as death. She stood still, barefoot in the wet grass, her gaze fixed on the house. "Urina," I whispered, barely breathing. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a trembling hand and tapped 3 times on the porch railing, then vanished like mist. The next day, the village priest came to visit. Father Petro was an austere man, with a face worn by years of harsh winters and spiritual burdens. I told him what I had seen and heard. "You have disturbed something old and restless," he said gravely. "The forest holds its secrets. To calm a wandering spirit, you must honor her story, bring her memory to light, and release her pain." He gave me an old wooden cross carved with symbols of protection and a small vial of holy water. That evening, I prepared a simple altar in the main room, candles, a photo of the village church, and the cross. I sprinkled holy water around the house, chanting prayers Father Petro had taught me. As the last candle flickered, I felt a presence, soft, cold, sorrowful, settle beside me. In the silence, I heard her voice, barely a whisper. Find my child, free us both. Driven by a mixture of fear and compassion, I spent the next days combing the forest for anything that might give me a clue, a lost keepsake, a forgotten grave. On the fourth day, deep among the twisted roots of an ancient oak, I found a small, rusted tin box. Inside were two fragile items, a faded lock of golden hair and a rusted silver pendant shaped like a bird. The pendant was engraved with a date, the year Urina vanished. That night, I returned to the house and placed the box on the altar. As the candles burned low, the temperature dropped sharply. A figure appeared by the window, her white dress stained with dirt and leaves. She smiled then, a sad but peaceful smile. "Thank you," she said, voice like wind through the pines. "You have remembered me." The tapping stopped. The forest breathed again. In the mornings that followed, the house felt lighter, the shadows less deep. The village slowly returned to its usual rhythm. On my last night, I dreamed of Urina standing at the edge of the forest, holding a small child in her arms. They both smiled, then faded into the dawn light. I left Zolotaya Dolina the next day, but the memory stayed with me, of a restless spirit, a forgotten story, and the ancient power of remembrance. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The wind was biting cold that late October evening as I drove the narrow, twisting road leading to my grandmother's old village of Velika Reka, deep in the mountains of eastern Bosnia. The trees lining the path were skeletal, their branches scratching at the car like long, crooked fingers. I had been called back to the village by my aunt, who told me that Grandma's health was failing fast and that I needed to come. It had been years since I'd set foot there. The village was a relic. Most of its younger generation had fled to the cities, and only a handful of elderly folks remained, stubborn as the land itself. I parked near the house my grandmother had built with her own hands decades ago. It sat at the edge of the village, overlooking a small river that roared louder than usual after the recent rains. The house was made of rough-hewn stone and dark, weathered wood. A faint glow flickered from inside. I stepped inside and found my grandmother sitting by the stove, wrapped in a heavy woolen shawl. Her eyes were sharp but shadowed with years of sorrow and something darker, something I hadn't seen before. "You came," she said in a voice rough as gravel. "I did. I did. How are you feeling, Grandma?" She smiled thinly. "Old and tired. But there are things you must know before I leave this world." That night, she told me stories I had never heard before. Stories about the land, the river, and the spirits that lurked in the forests. She spoke of the Mora, the restless souls that wander in the twilight, and the Villa, spirits of the woods who could be cruel or kind depending on the respect given. But most chilling was her warning about the prikaza, the apparitions of the dead who do not rest. "They say," she whispered, "that if you see the prikaza, you must not speak to it, or else it will take you to the other side and you will never return." I nodded, half amused, half unnerved. It was the kind of tale told to children to keep them indoors after dark. But as the night deepened, a coldness crept through the walls, and I heard faint whispers carried by the wind outside. I closed the window tightly. The next day, Grandma was weaker. I took her to the small chapel at the village center, where the old priest was waiting. Father Milan was an aging man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. He blessed Grandma with holy water and whispered prayers to keep evil at bay. On the way back, I noticed villagers eyeing me with suspicion. A few muttered under their breath about the curse and the dark nights. That evening, as I sat by the fire alone in the house, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing the yard. I looked through the window, but there was no one there. The moonlight painted the garden in ghostly silver, but it was empty. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or an animal. But then came the sound. Soft, mournful singing, barely audible, carried on the breeze. It was a woman's voice, sweet yet filled with sorrow. I recognized the tune. It was a lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me. The air grew colder. The fire sputtered. Suddenly, the front door creaked open on its own. I stood frozen, heart hammering. The doorway was filled with mist, swirling like smoke, and within it, I saw her, a pale woman in a white dress, dripping wet as if she had just risen from the river. Her eyes were black wells, her hair clinging to her face in tangled strands. She opened her mouth to sing again, but instead a terrible silence filled the room. She stepped inside, and the temperature dropped so sharply that my breath came out in white clouds. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. She did not answer. Instead, she pointed to the river visible through the window and vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. The next morning, I told Grandma and Father Milan what I had seen. Grandma's face went pale, and Father Milan crossed himself fiercely. "That is the Vodna Zhena, the water woman," Grandma said quietly. "She is a spirit of the river, a soul lost between worlds. She appears before tragedy, warning, or cursing." Father Milan added, "She haunts the river because she drowned, but cannot rest. We must perform a ritual at the water's edge before nightfall, or she will claim another." We gathered a small group of villagers, and as dusk fell, we made our way to the riverbank. The water was cold and swollen from recent rains. Father Milan sprinkled holy water and chanted prayers, while Grandma placed handfuls of salt and bread on the river stones, offerings to the spirits. As the final prayer ended, a chilling scream echoed across the water. The surface rippled violently, and for a moment I saw a pale face emerging, a woman's face twisted in agony, her eyes pleading. Then the river stilled. We hurried back to the village, but that night was restless. I awoke to the sound of crying outside my window. Looking out, I saw her again, the Vodena Zhena. This time, her mouth was stitched shut with dark thread, but tears streamed down her cheeks. She reached toward me, a silent plea for help or revenge. I felt paralyzed, unable to move or speak. Suddenly, she vanished, leaving only the scent of wet earth and decay. The next days passed in a haze. Grandma's condition worsened, and the village grew tense. Strange things happened. Livestock found dead with no wounds, shadowy figures glimpsed in the forests, doors opening and closing on their own. One night, I was awakened by a soft knocking at the window. It was her again. I couldn't resist. I opened the window, just a crack. Her stitched mouth moved, and I heard a whisper, "Save me." I knew then that she was not just a spirit of vengeance, but a soul trapped in torment. Grandma's last wish was for me to find the truth behind the tragedy that bound the Vodena Zhena to the river. I spent days in the village archives piecing together the story of Maria, a young bride from Velika Reka who drowned under mysterious circumstances decades ago. Some said she was pushed, others whispered of jealousy and betrayal. Her husband disappeared shortly after, and no one ever spoke of her again, except in hushed warnings. Determined, I returned to the riverbank at night, armed with a cross, salt, and the old songs Grandma taught me. I called out to Maria, promising to help her find peace. The river's surface shimmered, and she appeared once more. This time, her mouth was unstitched, and she sang the lullaby with a voice filled with sorrow and longing. As the song ended, her figure slowly dissolved into the mist, and the river calmed. The following morning, the village seemed lighter, as if a heavy burden had lifted. Grandma smiled weakly and passed away peacefully that night. I stayed a few more days, helping the villagers with rites and prayers. Before I left, Father Milan handed me a small wooden charm carved with ancient Slavic symbols. "For protection," he said, "because the spirits never truly leave." Back in the city, I sometimes hear the lullaby in the wind or catch a glimpse of pale figures in reflections. The Vodena Zhena still lingers somewhere between worlds, a reminder of the past's power and the thin veil that separates us from the restless dead. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The village of Staraya Dolina had never been a place you'd find on most maps. Nestled deep within the Carpathian foothills, it seemed trapped in a forgotten time, where ancient customs lingered and the modern world's reach was tenuous at best. I was born there, or rather, in the small hospital in Ivano-Frankivsk, but my childhood memories were all soaked with the scent of pine and damp earth, the creaking wooden houses, and the stories whispered by my grandmother in the flickering firelight. I left Staraya Dolina when I was 18 to study history in Lviv, and then later moved to Kiev. The city life was intoxicating, the noise, the crowds, the endless possibilities. I thought I had escaped the village's weight, the stories and the shadows that clung to it like cobwebs. But death has a way of pulling us back. My grandmother passed away just after winter melted into spring. She had been the last elder of the village, the keeper of its stories and secrets. My parents, busy with their own lives, asked me to come and settle her affairs and prepare the old house for sale. I arrived one overcast afternoon, the sky low and gray, the air smelling faintly of moss and smoke. The village was quieter than I remembered, the dirt roads muddy and riddled with ruts from last night's rain. Most of the younger people had moved away. The houses that remained stood as hollow reminders of lives once lived. The old house sat on a knoll overlooking the forest, its wooden shingles warped and peeling. As I stepped inside, a chill crept over me. It was as though the walls themselves remembered things better left forgotten. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, and a faint smell of tobacco and herbs lingered in the air, my grandmother's scent. I spent the first day sorting through old things, photographs and faded letters in Cyrillic, many stained by time and tears. At night, the wind pressed against the window panes like desperate fingers, and the silence seemed so complete it roared in my ears. On the second evening, as I prepared to sleep in the room where I once had my bed as a child, I noticed something peculiar. The room was cold, unseasonably so, even with the stove still warm. I pulled the blanket tighter, but the temperature didn't rise. Then, just before I drifted off, I heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, not my own. I held my breath, waiting for a door to creak or a whisper, but nothing else followed. The next morning, I found muddy footprints near the back door. Small, bare, and wet. There hadn't been rain, and the ground was frozen hard the day before. I felt a prickle of unease, but brushed it aside. Later, in the village store, I asked about strange happenings. The shopkeeper, an old man with a long gray beard, looked at me gravely. "You should not be here alone at night," he warned. "Not since the spring thaw. The leshy is restless." I blinked, confused. "The leshy?" I repeated. He nodded solemnly. "The forest spirit, the keeper of the woods. When the snow melts, he walks, watching, waiting. He does not like those who disturb the old paths." I laughed nervously. "I'm just here to clean my grandmother's house." The man's eyes narrowed. "That house is tied to the forest, and the forest is tied to what you cannot see." That night, the wind picked up, howling through the eaves like a wild animal. Around midnight, the knocks came, soft, 3 taps on the wooden door. I sat frozen on the bed, heart pounding. The knocking repeated, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Then silence. When I finally dared to look outside, nothing was there but the thick fog creeping in from the forest. For the next few days, strange things escalated. I heard whispers in the trees, unintelligible words carried on the wind. At night, I saw glimpses of figures moving just beyond the window, shadowy and half seen. One evening, I found a bundle of herbs and twigs hanging on the door. A protection, perhaps, left by my grandmother. I remembered the stories she told me as a child about forest spirits, about appeasing them with offerings of bread, salt, and herbs. I placed them carefully at the windows and doors. Still, the cold seeped in. Then, on the third night, I dreamt of a woman. She was tall and thin, with long, tangled black hair that shimmered like the dark forest itself. Her eyes were deep pools of sorrow, and her pale dress fluttered as though underwater. She reached for me, voice like the rustling leaves. "Help me." I woke, drenched in sweat. When I opened my eyes, I saw her standing by the window, just beyond the glass. Not a reflection. She did not blink. I couldn't move. She lifted a hand and traced a finger down the glass, leaving a trail of frost in its wake. The next morning, I found scratches on the window frame, deep and jagged. I searched the village for answers, but the locals only looked away. In the old churchyard, I found a gravestone, weathered and cracked. The name was barely legible. Anastasia. A woman who had disappeared from the village more than 100 years ago, said to have been lost in the forest one spring. Some whispered she had been cursed, others that she was a forest witch taken by the Leshy. I realized the woman in my dreams was her. That night, the hauntings worsened. The knocking grew louder, pounding now like a heartbeat. The whispers turned to cries, echoing through the walls. I tried to sleep in the living room near the stove. The fire sputtered and died inexplicably, plunging me into darkness. Then the temperature plummeted, my breath forming clouds in the air. Suddenly, the room filled with the scent of wet earth and decay. And then I saw her again, inside the house this time. She stood at the foot of the stairs, hair tangled, dress torn, eyes hollow. She reached out, voice trembling. "Free me." I was rooted to the spot. In the days that followed, I searched the diary of my grandmother, hoping for clues. Among the pages was a ritual, an old Slavic rite to free trapped souls bound by forest curses. The ritual required a midnight journey into the forest, to the place where the woman's body was said to have been found. There I was to leave offerings of bread, salt, and wild herbs, and recite prayers in the old tongue. That night, lantern in hand, I ventured into the dark woods, the forest alive with sounds, cracking branches, distant howls, the whisper of leaves. At the clearing by the ancient oaks, I laid the offerings carefully. As I began to chant the prayer, the air thickened. From the shadows emerged the woman, no longer terrifying but peaceful, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you," she whispered. The wind stilled, the oppressive cold lifted. I felt the weight in the house ease. When I returned, the knocking ceased. The whispers were gone, and for the first time in days, I slept. I left Staraya Dolina soon after, but sometimes when the wind shifts and the night is still, I remember the woman in white and the forest's ancient sorrow, and I wonder if some spirits are destined to wait forever between worlds, caught in the twilight of forgotten legends. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I grew up hearing stories about our family's old ancestral village, nestled somewhere in the remote woods of Ukraine near the Carpathians. My grandmother, with her deep-set eyes and hushed voice, always warned me not to speak about the things she called the old burdens, secrets buried in the shadows of our past. When I was a child, I thought those stories were just the usual folk tales, spirits, witches, and demons woven into the fabric of rural life to keep children obedient and wary. But as I grew older, the line between folklore and reality blurred, and I realized some of those tales weren't just stories. They were warnings. Real warnings. It happened the summer after I finished university. I was 24, restless, looking for something to connect me to my roots. That's when I decided to visit my grandmother's village. She had passed away a year earlier, and no one was left there. The villagers had slowly moved away, leaving behind empty homes and the silent forest creeping close. The village, called Veliki Lisiki, lay deep in the woods, a few hours from the nearest town. The road was a rough dirt track, swallowed by tall pine trees that seemed to lean in as I drove by. When I arrived, the village was eerily quiet. The houses were old, wooden, and some were half collapsed, swallowed by vines and moss. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves hung in the air. My grandmother's house stood at the edge of the village. It was small and weathered but sturdy, with peeling white paint and a roof patched with rusty tin. I pushed open the gate, the hinges squealing, and stepped inside. The house was cold and smelled of old wood and smoke. I spent the day cleaning and unpacking a few things I'd brought with me: clothes, a notebook, and a small bundle of herbs my grandmother had given me before she died. She had told me they were for protection, that the old spirits were restless. That first night, I sat by the fireplace, the only source of warmth and light. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a chill that felt deeper than the night air. I tried to sleep, but kept hearing faint noises, soft footsteps on the porch, whispers carried on the wind, the creaking of branches brushing against the house. Around midnight, the whispers grew louder, becoming indistinct words in Ukrainian, murmured and urgent. I sat up, heart pounding, and felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. Turning quickly, I saw nothing but the flickering shadows cast by the dying fire. In the days that followed, the atmosphere worsened. Objects moved on their own. A chair shifted slightly, a door creaked open and shut without wind. At dusk, I often heard distant singing, haunting and melancholy, echoing from the forest. It sounded like an old folk song, but twisted off-key as if sung by voices not quite human. One evening, an old man appeared on the path outside my window. He was dressed in traditional clothing, a thick wool coat and a hat with a wide brim. His eyes were dark and tired, but he smiled kindly. "You are far from the city," he said in a rough voice. "What brings you here?" "I'm my grandmother's granddaughter," I answered. "I came to see the village, to remember." He nodded slowly. "The old ways still linger here. Be careful. Not everything that walks the woods means well." I asked him about the singing. "Those are the rusalka," he said. "Water spirits, but not like the fairy tales. They are angry, vengeful. They haunt the lakes and rivers, but sometimes they come closer, especially when the dead are not at rest." I listened carefully, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I asked about the forest. "It is full of the unclean, the lost souls, the cursed. They remember the blood spilled here long ago. Your family, too, has old debts with the spirits." I didn't understand, but the man shook his head and disappeared down the path as quietly as he had come. That night, I dreamt of the forest. The trees were blackened and twisted, their branches reaching like claws. Shadows moved between the trunks, glowing eyes watching me. A cold voice whispered my name, pulling me deeper into the woods. I woke with a start to the sound of pounding at the door. I hesitated, then opened it a crack. No one was there. But on the doorstep lay a bundle of wilted lilies, tied with a black ribbon. I picked them up, and a sudden chill ran through me. I recognized them from my grandmother's stories. Lilies meant death, or a warning from the other side. The nights grew worse. Doors slammed shut as I passed, whispers followed me through the house, and the scratching returned, this time from the cellar. The cellar door was old and heavy, made of thick oak, covered with strange symbols carved deep into the wood. I never dared to open it. On the seventh night, I heard a voice calling from the cellar. It was a woman's voice, pleading and desperate. "Help me. Release me." Against my better judgment, I grabbed a lantern and forced the door open. The cold that rushed out was suffocating. Inside, the cellar was a stone-walled chamber, damp and dark. In the corner lay an old wooden box bound with iron straps. I approached cautiously and pried the box open. Inside were bones, small, delicate, feminine, and a tattered piece of cloth embroidered with faded red thread. I felt a sudden presence behind me and turned sharply, but there was no one. That night, the singing came again, louder and closer. I heard footsteps on the stairs, whispers at my window. Shadows moved through the rooms. The air was thick with sorrow and rage. I realized then what my grandmother meant by old burdens. The box was a prison, holding something ancient and vengeful. The bones were not just remains, they were a key, a tether to the restless spirit trapped beneath the house. I found an old book in the attic, a handwritten grimoire bound in cracked leather. It spoke of a ritual, a sacrifice made centuries ago to keep a rusalka bound. A woman drowned unjustly, her spirit cursed to haunt the waters and woods. The family had taken the blame to protect the village, burying her remains beneath the house. But the ritual had to be renewed every generation, or the spirit would rise and claim what it was owed. The charm my grandmother had given me was part of the ritual, meant to keep the spirit locked away. But I had broken the cycle by opening the box. The next night, the rusalka came. She was pale and dripping, with long hair floating like kelp in water. Her eyes were black voids, her mouth twisted in sorrow and rage. She whispered in the old tongue, a song of pain and betrayal. I begged for mercy, but she only repeated, "Release me." I remembered the ritual from the grimoire. To restore the balance, I had to return the bones to the box, bury it deep beneath the roots of the oldest tree in the forest, and offer a token of blood as an apology. With shaking hands, I carried the box outside to the ancient oak. The forest was alive with eyes, watching, waiting. I dug a hole, cold earth crumbling, and placed the box inside. I cut my palm with a small knife and let the blood drip onto the soil. The singing stopped, the air cleared. For the first time in days, the forest was silent. I returned to the village, but the house felt empty, as if a great weight had lifted. The villagers nodded at me respectfully when I passed, their eyes no longer wary. Before I left, I visited the small lake nearby. The water was still and dark. I tossed a handful of wildflowers onto the surface, and for a moment, the water shimmered. I never spoke of it to anyone outside the village. Some things are meant to be remembered only in whispers, carried on the wind through the silent woods. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I hear that haunting song just beyond the trees. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The village of Verkivka lay nestled deep within the dense, dark forests of western Ukraine, where the trees stood like ancient sentinels, their branches tangled and gnarled as if woven by invisible hands. I had never intended to stay there. My life in Kyiv, hectic and loud, had left me hollow. And after my mother passed, I inherited her small cottage in the village, a place I barely remembered from childhood visits. Alone and restless, I thought I could find solace in the quiet, maybe even inspiration for the stories I wanted to write. The cottage was old, built from rough logs and stone, with a steeply pitched roof sagging under decades of harsh winters. It was surrounded by wild grass and untamed blackberry bushes, and a narrow dirt road wound through the forest to the village proper. The villagers themselves were a few dozen mostly elderly people, who eyed me with a mixture of curiosity and wariness when I arrived. The first few days were uneventful, apart from the crushing silence that filled the place. The forest swallowed the sound of birds and insects, leaving only the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant howl of wolves. At night, the air felt heavy, like the earth was holding its breath. One evening, I sat by the fireplace reading a book of old Slavic folklore, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, a cold wind rattled the windows, but it was the sudden knocking that made me freeze, the sound coming from the front door, slow and deliberate. I thought it was a visitor, but when I opened the door, no one was there. Just the dark woods and the wet scent of moss. That night, I heard it again. Not knocking this time, but soft whispers carried through the cracks of the old walls. They were barely audible, like voices caught on the edge of hearing, speaking in the local dialect I barely understood. The words were fragmented but chilling. Help, find, not lost, come home. I tried to dismiss it as the wind, but the unease settled deep in my chest. The villagers had warned me vaguely about the woods and the spirits that lingered, but no one spoke openly of what haunted the place. The next day I visited the village elder, Baba Olena, a stooped woman with silver hair braided tightly and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through time itself. She lived in a small hut filled with dried herbs and talismans. "You've stirred her," she said without preamble when I told her about the noises. "The one who waits." "Who?" I asked. "Yaroslava. A girl from here, long ago. They say she was betrayed by those she trusted, killed near the forest's edge. Her soul never found rest." "Why do you think she's here now?" "Because you are the one who listens. The spirits are restless when forgotten. You must help her find peace." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. That night, I resolved to find out more. I walked to the edge of the forest, lantern in hand, the path winding between ancient oaks whose limbs clawed the sky. A thick mist rolled in, chilling me to the bone. Suddenly, I heard a soft crying. A pale figure appeared between the trees. Yaroslava. She was young, her face streaked with tears, her white dress torn and dirty. Her eyes met mine, pleading. "Help me," she whispered. "Find the truth. Free me." I felt an icy cold grip my heart, and for a moment I thought I might faint, but I steadied myself and promised to help. Returning to the village, I combed through old records and spoke to the oldest villagers. What I found was a story of jealousy and betrayal. Yaroslava had been engaged to a local man, Ivan, who vanished mysteriously the same night she died. Some whispered he had been killed by rivals or fled after a terrible secret. Yaroslava was found at the forest's edge, strangled and broken, her baby missing. The village never spoke of the child again. The more I uncovered, the heavier the atmosphere in the cottage grew. Objects moved slightly on their own. Doors creaked, lights flickered. I felt watched constantly. The whispers returned, more urgent now, guiding me toward the forest clearing where Yaroslava's body was found. One evening, armed with a small shovel and lantern, I went there. The ground was soft and disturbed, roots gnarled as if hiding something beneath. I began to dig, the earth cold and unyielding. Hours passed. Finally, my shovel hit something hard, a small wooden box. Inside was a rusted chain with a tiny locket, worn smooth with age. I opened it to find a faded portrait of a baby and a note in delicate handwriting, "For my daughter, to keep her close." Suddenly, a wind whipped through the clearing, carrying a mournful sigh. Yaroslava appeared again, her expression softened, hope in her eyes. "You have found her," she said, voice barely a breath. "Thank you." The mist enveloped her, and she vanished into the night. Back at the cottage, the air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. The knocking stopped, the whispers faded. I stayed in Verkivka a few more weeks, writing the story of Yaroslava and her lost child, a tale of love, betrayal, and restless spirits. The villagers no longer watched me with suspicion, and the forest seemed less foreboding. On my last night, I dreamed of Yaroslava standing at the forest's edge, her face serene, the child cradled in her arms. She smiled at me, whispering a final goodbye before fading with the dawn light. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I still hear faint tapping at my window, but it is no longer threatening, just a soft reminder that some spirits linger until their stories are told. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The village of Lyeskovats lay hidden deep within the dark forests of western Ukraine. surrounded by endless stretches of ancient trees and thick mist that clung like a shroud over the hills. It was a place forgotten by time, barely marked on any map, and the locals believed it was cursed. The stories they whispered about it were heavy with dread and old sorrow, tales passed down in low voices, especially when the nights grew long and cold. I had never planned to go there. It was my grandfather's birthplace, but the family had long since moved west, away from the shadows of that land. But when my grandmother died, she left me her house in Yeskovac. It was said to be abandoned for decades, a ruin reclaimed by the forest. The lawyers sent the papers. I had to go and see what remained. I arrived late one October afternoon. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The sky was low and gray, pressing down on the landscape. The dirt road leading into the village was overgrown and littered with broken branches. It was silent, save for the occasional caw of a raven perched high in the skeletal trees. The house stood at the village's edge, a squatting building, weather-beaten and leaning like an old man. The paint was long gone, and the windows were darkened by grime. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. Dust motes swirled in the fading light. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of mold and rot. The furniture was covered in sheets, and everything was coated in decades of dust. Yet the place had a strange feeling, like it was waiting for something. That first night, I lit the old stove, boiled some water, and tried to settle in. Outside, the wind picked up and howled through the cracks in the walls. I lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, pacing the floor above the living room. But when I called out, no one answered. The next morning, I explored the village ruins. Most of the houses were crumbling piles of stone and timber, swallowed by vines and moss. In the center was the church, a small, whitewashed building with a collapsed roof. The bell lay broken on the ground. An old woman appeared suddenly from the shadows of the trees. Her face was lined deep with age, her eyes sharp and wary. She introduced herself as Baba Teresa. "You should not be here," she said in a voice like dry leaves. "The dead do not rest in Yeskovac." I smiled nervously and said I was here to see the house. She shook her head. "Many before you came, and none stayed. The village is cursed. The night will take you if you're not careful." I thanked her and walked away, but her words echoed in my mind as night fell again. That evening, as darkness crept over the land, I heard a low whispering outside the house. It was soft and unintelligible, like voices carried on the wind. I peered out the window but saw nothing but the swaying trees. Suddenly the stove went cold. The room plunged into darkness as the oil lamp flickered and died. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and now they seemed to be right outside the window. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold night air bit at my skin. The forest stood silent and still except for the whispers, which now formed words in a language I barely understood, ancient Slavic, I realized with a shudder. "Vratit se," they chanted. "Return." From the shadows, a pale figure emerged, a woman in tattered clothing, her hair long and tangled, face gaunt and eyes hollow. She floated just above the ground, moving slowly toward the village. I stumbled back inside, locking the door behind me. Heart pounding. I searched for my phone but realized there was no signal. I was alone. The night was filled with strange sounds. Soft weeping, the creak of wood, the distant tolling of a bell that wasn't there. I tried to sleep, but was jolted awake by a sudden loud crash downstairs. Gathering what little courage I had, I grabbed a candle and went to investigate. In the living room, the old grandfather clock had toppled, its glass shattered. On the floor, near the broken glass, lay a bundle of dried flowers and a small wooden cross carved with unfamiliar symbols. I picked them up. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing my candle. In the darkness, I felt a presence, something watching. I whispered a prayer, and the air grew still. Over the next days, the hauntings grew worse. Doors slammed, shadows moved independently, and that pale woman appeared at random, always at the edge of my vision, vanishing when I looked directly. One night, I followed her into the woods, where she led me to a small, hidden grave marked only by a fallen tree branch. I knelt beside it and saw the name Mila carved faintly into the earth. Baba Teresa later told me the story of Mila, a young woman accused of witchcraft during the war, burned at the stake in the forest near the village. Her spirit was said to haunt the land, seeking justice or vengeance. That night I dreamed I was in the forest. Mila stood before me, eyes filled with sorrow and rage. "You must free me," she said. "Tell them the truth." When I awoke, I knew what I had to do. I searched archives and old records in the nearest town, uncovering the brutal history of Mila's death, a miscarriage of justice fueled by fear and superstition. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the village and gathered the remaining villagers for a ritual of remembrance and apology at Mila's grave. We placed flowers, said prayers, and lit candles. As the last light flickered, a gentle breeze swept through the trees. The air grew warm for the first time since I arrived. That night, the hauntings ceased. The village fell silent, peaceful at last. I left Lieskovats with a heavy heart but a clear conscience, carrying the weight of its stories and the hope that some restless spirits might finally find their rest. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
The village of Kamenka was one of those places that seemed to be forgotten by time and the world. Nestled in the shadow of thick pine forests in western Ukraine, it was small, quiet, and a place where superstition still ruled more than reason. I never planned on going there. It was my grandfather's birthplace, but he left as a boy and never spoke of it, except for one warning. Never go back after dark. The past isn't done with you. When my grandfather passed away, I inherited a small wooden house on the outskirts of Kamenka. I was curious and stubborn, and I wanted to see it for myself. The house was old, built by my great-grandfather, or so I was told. It stood at the edge of the village, near the forest, isolated from the few other scattered homes. The journey to Kamenka was long and rough. The roads barely maintained, lined with trees that seemed to lean inward, as if watching every traveler pass. When I arrived, the village felt lifeless, the air thick with an uneasy silence. The few villagers I met were wary, eyes flicking away when I asked about my family or the house. The house was weathered but still standing firm. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and something else I couldn't name, a scent of decay mixed with damp wood and something faintly metallic. I spent the first day cleaning and exploring, trying to connect with the place. The walls were adorned with faded photographs and old icons, some cracked, others blurred by time. That first night, as I lay in the creaking bed, the wind whispered through the cracks in the wooden walls. It wasn't just the wind, though. There was a low murmur, like voices speaking softly in a language I barely recognized, Old Slavic, maybe even a dialect long forgotten. I tried to dismiss it as the sounds of the forest, but the whispers grew louder as darkness deepened. Around midnight, a scratching sound came from beneath the floorboards. At first, I thought it was a rat, but the pattern was too deliberate, like fingers tapping slowly, then faster. I pulled on my boots and went outside to get fresh air. The forest was black and silent, but the moment I stepped beyond the porch, I felt eyes watching me from the shadows. Over the next few days, strange things escalated. I found objects moved from their places. The kitchen knives rearranged, footprints in the dust, leading nowhere. Once, I heard a woman singing softly outside my window, a lullaby so sorrowful it chilled me to the bone. When I looked out, there was no one. One afternoon, I ventured into the village to talk to an old woman who had lived there her entire life. She was hunched over, her face a map of wrinkles, eyes sharp and bright despite her age. "You've come back," she said without preamble. "You don't know what you're stirring." "What do you mean?" I asked. She took my hand and looked deeply into my eyes. "Your family made a pact a long time ago. To keep the village safe, they bound a spirit here, a spirit that was wronged and restless. Every generation must renew the promise, or the spirit will come to collect its due." "Collect its due?" I repeated, a cold shiver crawling down my spine. "The Leshy," she whispered, "the forest spirit, protector and punisher. It walks between worlds, and it does not forgive." That night, I tried to sleep, but the shadows in the room seemed alive. At exactly midnight, the singing returned, louder now, coming from the forest. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat by the window, watching as a pale figure emerged from the trees. A woman in a tattered white dress, her hair long and tangled, eyes glowing faintly green. She walked slowly toward the house, her voice rising in a mournful chant. I felt a chill like icy fingers on my skin, the air thickening, suffocating. The temperature dropped rapidly. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted. Suddenly, she stopped just outside the porch, staring directly at me. Her mouth opened wide, but instead of words, a terrible silence poured out, pressing against my chest. Then she vanished. The next day, I found a small leather-bound book hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The pages were brittle and yellowed, written in a mix of Cyrillic and archaic script. It told of a woman named Marina, accused of witchcraft centuries ago and drowned in the nearby river. The villagers had tried to hide the truth by burying her remains beneath the house, hoping to keep her spirit bound. The book described a ritual to renew the pact, offerings of bread, salt, and blood performed every generation on the night of the summer solstice. It was meant to keep Marina's spirit from rising in anger. I realized then that my family had failed to perform the ritual in recent years. That was why the spirit had come. As the solstice approached, the forest around the house grew restless. Trees seemed to whisper threats, shadows lengthened unnaturally. At night, I heard footsteps pacing the hallways, doors opening and closing on their own. I saw fleeting glimpses of Marina's ghost, sometimes standing silently at the foot of my bed, sometimes reflected in the cracked mirror. On the night of the solstice, I prepared the offerings as described. I placed them on a small altar near the hearth, lit a candle, and began the chant from the book. The house groaned and shook. The wind howled outside, and the candle flickered wildly. Suddenly, the door slammed open. Marina stood in the doorway, her eyes blazing with fury. She raised a pale hand and spoke in a voice like the rustling of dead leaves. The debt must be paid. I felt my heart seize as she advanced. The candle went out, plunging me into darkness. I stumbled back, knocking over the altar. The offerings spilled on the floor and the room filled with a choking mist. Then, just as suddenly, the mist began to recede. A faint light returned and Marina's figure softened. She looked at me, sorrowful now, and whispered, "Remember." When dawn broke, the village was silent again. The oppressive weight lifted, and the forest seemed to breathe in relief. I understood then that the pact was fragile, a balance between the living and the dead, between protection and sacrifice. I left Kamenka soon after, but the memories haunt me still. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I hear that mournful song on the wind, reminding me that some debts never truly vanish, and some spirits never rest. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The village of Krynica lay deep in the Carpathian foothills, a place where time seemed to have slowed, wrapped in thick forests and winding dirt paths. The villagers lived simple, close-knit lives, steeped in tradition and wary of the dark woods that hemmed them in on all sides. My family had roots there for generations, but I left for the city when I was young, convinced the old tales were nothing more than superstition. Yet, after my grandfather's sudden death, I found myself compelled to return, if only to settle his affairs. I arrived in early autumn, when the leaves had just begun to bleed red and gold. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. My grandfather's house stood on the edge of the village, an old wooden structure that creaked and groaned with every gust of wind. The villagers eyed me with a mixture of curiosity and caution, some offering silent nods, others muttering warnings about the forest and the restless spirits said to dwell there. The first few nights passed quietly, save for the usual creaks and groans of an old house. But on the third night, something changed. I was roused from a deep sleep by the faint sound of singing. It was soft at first, barely audible but unmistakably a woman's voice. The melody was mournful, haunting, and seemed to drift from the forest beyond the house. I told myself it was the wind, or perhaps a neighbor singing late. Still, the voice unsettled me. When I stepped outside to listen, the night was still and the moon hidden behind heavy clouds. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt almost unnatural. The next day I asked the villagers about the singing. An old woman named Baba Marina, known for her knowledge of local lore, looked at me with weary eyes. "That is the song of the Pwenetnik," she said. A spirit of storms and waters, sometimes a guide, sometimes a warning. But many believe she lures travelers to their doom. I shrugged off her warning, attributing it to village superstition. But that evening, as twilight gave way to night, the singing returned, this time closer, clearer, echoing through the trees like a lament. Curiosity drew me toward the forest edge. The path was choked with underbrush and shadow, the trees towering and dense. As I stepped beneath their boughs, the air grew colder, heavier. The singing swirled around me, disembodied yet insistent. Suddenly a figure appeared, a woman with long dark hair dripping wet, her pale skin illuminated by a flicker of moonlight. Her eyes were deep wells of sorrow, and she smiled sadly at me. "Why do you come?" she asked, voice like the rustle of dead leaves. I stammered, unable to look away. "I am lost," she whispered. "Help me find peace." I wanted to flee, but something rooted me in place. She told me her story, how she had been betrayed by her village, accused of witchcraft, and drowned in the very river that carved through the forest. Her spirit could not rest, bound to the waters and the woods. Over the following days, strange things happened. I found wet footprints on the floorboards inside the house. Though no rain had fallen, shadows flickered at the edge of my vision. At night, the singing grew louder, more desperate. One night, I awoke to the sound of splashing water in the cellar. I descended the rickety stairs, lantern in hand, to find the floor slick with moisture and the faint echo of laughter, a child's laughter mixed with the woman's song. Terrified, I returned to Baba Marina, who instructed me in an ancient rite to free the spirit. We gathered herbs, mugwort, rue, and willow bark, and prepared a circle of salt and ash around the house. As midnight struck, we lit candles and recited prayers passed down through generations. The air grew thick, the temperature dropping sharply. A figure appeared in the center of the circle, the woman, her expression shifting from sorrow to rage. "You cannot bind me," she hissed. But the circle held, and with a final wail she vanished into the darkness. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, and the forest seemed lighter, the air less oppressive. The house no longer creaked with unseen footsteps, and the singing was gone. I stayed in Kranitsa a little longer, helping the villagers with the harvest and learning more of their customs. Yet, even as I left, I knew the forest still held secrets, dark, ancient, and waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear that distant, mournful song carried on the wind, a reminder that some spirits never truly rest. Story. The end.
Story number 9.
The village of Dobrynya lay folded deep in the Carpathian foothills, a forgotten place where modern life's reach was weak and old ways held sway. It was the kind of village where folk still whispered in the old tongue, where elders spoke of ancient spirits with reverence and fear. When my father died suddenly, I inherited his modest cottage on the edge of Dobrynya, a place I hadn't visited in years. I arrived in late autumn, just as the trees were bare and the skies grew leaden. The villagers eyed me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Few outsiders came, fewer still stayed. The house was small and ramshackle, with cracked plaster and a sagging roof. It smelled of wood smoke and something else, a dampness that clung to the walls like forgotten memories. The forest around it was thick, dark, and silent, except for the occasional rustle of dead leaves. On my first night, I lay in bed, the old wooden floor creaking beneath me, and I heard the faintest tapping at the window, soft as the fall of a dry twig. When I looked, nothing was there. Days passed, and I tried to settle into the rhythm of village life. I visited the market square, bought bread from the old baker, and listened to the stories the locals told in hushed tones. They spoke of the rusalka, water spirits who lured men into the river to drown, and the domovoi, the household guardian spirits who could turn malevolent if angered. But what haunted them most was the tale of the court, a demon of the forest known to steal souls and twist dreams. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I walked to the river where my father used to fish. The water was dark and sluggish, reflecting the bruised sky. I stood at the bank, watching the ripples, when suddenly the surface broke. A woman's face emerged, pale, wet, her dark hair streaming in the water like seaweed. Her eyes were empty pits that seemed to pull at my very soul. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and she vanished beneath the surface with a terrible splash. That night, I was restless. At midnight, a soft singing floated through the walls of the house. It was a haunting melody, sweet and sad, sung in a voice not quite human. I followed it to the cellar door, where the air was cold and smelled of damp earth. The singing stopped as I opened the door, plunging me into darkness. I lit a candle and descended the creaking steps. The cellar was empty, except for a small wooden box tucked into a corner. Inside, I found a bundle of old letters tied with faded ribbon. They were written by my grandmother to a man named Ivan, a soldier who never returned from the war. The letters spoke of love, loss, and a secret promise made beneath the ancient oak tree by the river. The following days brought more strange happenings. Shadows shifted just beyond the corner of my eye. At times, I heard whispers in the forest, voices calling my name. The village dogs howled all night, and the river seemed to swell even without rain. Desperate, I sought out Baba Yelena, the village wise woman known for her knowledge of spirits. Her hut was a swirl of herbs and smoke. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to pierce my soul and said, "The past is restless here. The river holds what was taken, and it wants to give it back." She performed a ritual by the river, burning sage and whispering prayers in an old language I barely understood. As the smoke curled upward, I felt a chill, and the water began to bubble and churn. A figure rose once again, the pale woman from the water, but this time her face was clearer. She was no demon, but a grieving spirit, trapped between worlds. Baba Yelena explained she was a rusalka, the spirit of a woman betrayed and drowned unjustly. Her sorrow had poisoned the river and unsettled the village. To appease her, we had to find Ivan's grave and lay her heart to rest. I searched the forest with Baba Yelena and found a small, overgrown cemetery hidden beneath tangled branches. There lay Ivan's grave, marked by a crooked wooden cross. We dug carefully and discovered a small iron box containing a heart-shaped pendant engraved with my grandmother's initials. That night, we returned to the river. Baba Yelena recited incantations as I held the pendant above the water. The rusalka appeared one final time, her expression softening. She reached out, touched the pendant, and slowly faded away with a sigh that echoed like the wind through the trees. The river calmed, the forest quieted, and the village seemed lighter. I knew that the spirits were still there, watching, waiting, but for the first time, there was peace. I stayed in Dobrynia longer than planned, learning the old ways and honoring the past. My father's house no longer felt empty, but alive with stories and memories. The villagers welcomed me as one of their own, and I understood that some places are bound not just by land, but by the restless souls who never truly leave. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The village of Malinovka was the kind of place that time forgot, tucked away deep in the Ukrainian Carpathians, where dense forests stretched for miles and the rivers whispered secrets of the past. Growing up, I had always heard the stories from my grandmother, tales of dark woods, spirits, and restless souls trapped between worlds. But like most young people, I dismissed them as myths, superstition, folklore meant to scare children into obedience. When I was 24, working as a journalist in Kyiv, I was assigned to write an article about rural depopulation and the fading of traditional life in the Carpathian villages. I took it as an opportunity to reconnect with my roots. I decided to stay in Malinovka, the village my family came from, hoping to gather stories and photographs for the piece. The villagers were wary at first. Their eyes held a coldness, or perhaps suspicion, when I introduced myself. They spoke in hushed tones, warning me to respect the old ways, to avoid the forest after dusk. There was one man, Ivan, a retired hunter, who told me bluntly, "There are things in those woods that don't belong to this world. You want to see? Then go, but don't say I didn't warn you." Curious and hungry for a good story, I ignored the warnings. The first day, I spent interviewing elders, collecting tales of harvests, weddings, and village life. But as night fell, an unease settled over me. The wooden house where I stayed creaked under the weight of silence and shadows, and the wind through the cracks sounded like whispered voices. Around midnight on my second night, I woke to the sound of faint singing drifting through the window, a woman's voice, haunting and melancholy. I sat up, heart pounding. The melody was unlike any lullaby I knew, sorrowful and strange, carrying an unexplainable sadness. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and stepped outside. The moon was obscured by thick clouds, and the forest edge loomed black and still. The singing came again, closer this time, as if someone was walking through the trees. Drawn inexplicably, I followed the sound into the dark woods. The forest was alive with rustling leaves and snapping twigs beneath my feet. I called out softly, but the voice only grew more distant, leading me deeper. Suddenly, the singing stopped. A chill ran through me. I turned to go back, but noticed a pale figure standing between the trunks, an ethereal woman, her hair tangled and wet, her eyes deep wells of sorrow. She wore a tattered white dress, stained with mud and riverweed. Her face was beautiful but ghastly, almost translucent. "Help me," she whispered, her voice like the wind over graves. Fear rooted me, but also pity. I wanted to speak, to ask who she was, but no words came. She vanished, dissolving into mist as the wind picked up, back leaving the scent of wet earth and something metallic, like blood. I ran back to the village, heart racing. The next morning, Ivan was waiting at the edge of the forest, face grave. "You saw her," he said. I nodded, recounting what I had seen. "That is the Rusalka," Ivan said, lowering his voice. "A spirit of the drowned, cursed to linger. She's been trapped here for decades, longing for release." He told me the story. Years ago, a young woman named Olena was accused of witchcraft by jealous villagers. They dragged her to the river and drowned her, her screams swallowed by the cold water. Since then, her spirit haunted the river and the surrounding woods, singing to lure the living into the depths. That night, the singing returned, louder and more desperate. I stayed inside, locking every door and window, but I heard soft tapping on the walls, and sometimes I felt a cold breath on my neck. Days passed, and the villagers began to disappear one by one. Some were found drowned in the river, others vanished without a trace. The village was gripped by terror and silence. Determined to end the curse, I sought the advice of Baba Yaga, an old woman who lived alone in a hut deep in the forest, reputed to be a healer and seer. When I found her, she was hunched over a cauldron, chanting in a language I barely understood. "You cannot fight her with fear," she told me, "only with compassion and remembrance." She gave me a bundle of herbs, willow, mugwort, and vervain, and instructed me to perform a ritual by the river at midnight, offering a wreath of flowers and speaking Olena's name aloud, asking for forgiveness. That night, I followed her instructions. The river was swollen and wild, the water dark and swift. I laid the wreath on the surface, watching it float away, and called to Olena, begging her to find peace. The air thickened, the water roiled, and suddenly the Rusalka emerged. Her face was streaked with tears, her expression softening. "Thank you," she whispered before dissolving into mist. After that night, the village slowly returned to life. The singing ceased, the disappearances stopped. The forest felt lighter, the river calm. But sometimes when the wind shifts just right, I swear I hear a faint melody on the breeze, a song of sorrow and release, echoing from the depths of the river and the heart of the forest, reminding me that some wounds run deeper than death, and some spirits never truly rest. Story the end.